they pinned a for sale sign on my back at the market. Right there, in broad daylight, between the shoulder blades of the sweater, I knitted myself last winter when the nights felt longer than usual. I didn't feel it at first. You'd think you'd feel something, an unfamiliar pressure, the shift in fabric, but no. It just hung there, like another weight I wasn't supposed to notice. And I didn't. Not until a kind-faced woman in her 60s, maybe younger than me, but not by much, tapped me on the elbow, leaned in, and said with the gentlest voice I've heard in years, "Excuse me, ma'am. I think someone's put something on your back." I reached, around, awkward, stiff in the shoulder, and when my fingers touched the edge of paper, my stomach dropped. I pulled it off slowly, like peeling away a piece of skin that wasn't mine to lose, and I read the words 3 times before they made sense. For sale. Quiet, good with kids, mild wear and tear, best offer. I remember blinking at the paper as if it would change if I stared long enough, but it didn't. It just stayed what it was, mocking, final, and real. I'm 78. I used to run a small fabric shop with my late husband. God rest him. For 32 years, we stitched and measured and ironed until the walls themselves smelled like starch and memory. After he passed, I closed the shop. It was too much to keep up on my own. Too many steps, too many stairs, too many people asking, "You still hanging on in there?" Like my existence was a favor they were running low on. I sold the lease and moved into the spare room at my daughter's house, thinking, foolishly, that blood meant welcome. At the time, I believed in words like home, help, and family. I believed them like gospel, and for a while, things were fine. Quiet, manageable. I cooked meals, folded laundry, walked the dog when they were busy, made birthday banners by hand, the old-fashioned way. I knew I wasn't wanted, not really, but I thought I was needed, and that was enough to stay. But need is a slippery thing. It wears out quicker than love, and it disappears without explanation. Over time, I became a shadow in my daughter's bright kitchen, moving quietly, stepping aside when the fridge opened, waiting until everyone else was done before making tea. My name was replaced with Grandma, in the kind of tone you'd use for a worn-out slipper. Familiar, but not something you'd wear in public. Then came the market. My daughter and her husband had started selling homemade preserves on Saturdays. Apricot, fig, sometimes a lemon thyme that always smelled more like soap than fruit. I helped, of course. I always helped. Up at 6, slicing samples, tying ribbons on jars, filling the thermos. I wore the apron they gave me, white, clean, with their logo stitched crookedly on the chest. I stood behind the table and smiled politely at strangers who never looked me in the eye. That morning, I remember, I'd brought a small tin of hand-sewn sachets, lavender, rose petals, peppermint from my own garden. I placed them at the edge of the table like offerings. "They'll just clutter the space, Mom," my daughter had said, moving them behind a display of jam jars. I nodded, pretending not to mind. I always nodded. I don't know when exactly they stuck the sign on me. It must have been before the rush, maybe during setup, maybe while I bent to zip the sample box. I replayed the morning in my mind again and again, trying to find the moment, the instant my usefulness expired and became a joke. Because that's what it was, wasn't it? A joke. A little inside humor to share with the hip couples buying peach preserves and basil pesto. Something to giggle at behind paper coffee cups. Ha 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 ha. Look at the old lady. Isn't she cute? Quiet, good with kids, mild wear and tear. Maybe I'll take her home and sit her by the fire like a rescued puppy. I could have pretended it was harmless, could have told myself it was an accident, a prank, even a misunderstanding. But I saw my daughter's face when I showed her the paper, the way her mouth twisted upward, not quite a smile, more like a shrug you give when you're caught. It's just a bit of fun, Mom. Lighten up. You're so sensitive these days. And then she turned back to the customer who wanted 2 jars of cherry ginger and a small tote. Just like that. Like it hadn't happened. I held that paper in my hand for the rest of the day. I folded it once, then twice, then again, until it was the size of a sugar packet. I slipped it into my pocket and felt it every time I moved. Not because I wanted to keep it, but because I needed to remember. Because forgetting would mean forgiving, and I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. I stayed silent through the rest of the market. Packed the tablecloth, the folding crates, the leftover jars, carried everything back to the car. No one asked if I was all right. No one noticed I hadn't spoken since noon. In the car ride home, the radio played softly, and my daughter hummed. The kind of hum that fills in silence you don't want to explore. My son-in-law asked what we should have for dinner. I said nothing. I stared out the window and watched as the world passed by, unaware that it had changed forever. That night, I laid the folded sign on the bed and smoothed it out. The ink had bled slightly, cheap marker, maybe something grabbed last minute from a drawer. It wasn't even written neatly. The R in 4 dipped awkwardly. The A in sale was missing its crossbar. Sloppy, thoughtless, quick, and yet so final. I stared at it for what felt like an hour, tracing the letters with my finger like they were a name I was trying to forget. I thought about the way my daughter used to draw as a child. Carefully, with 2 hands, her tongue sticking out the side of her mouth. I thought about the years I spent teaching her to write her name, to spell apple, to read books with long words like imagination and remember. I thought about all the labels I'd ever sewn into clothes. Handmade by Mom. With love from home, made for you. And now here I was labeled myself, for sale. No love, no home, just product. I didn't cry. Not that night, not the next. My tears dried up sometime in my 60s, I think, after Derek died, and I realized there was no one left to carry the other side of the silence. I became good at folding pain into manageable shapes, like laundry. Neat, contained. But that night, I didn't sleep. I just sat in the chair by the window and watched the streetlight flicker against the driveway. And I decided something. Not with drama, not with fury. Quietly, like boiling water or wind through pine. I decided I wasn't going to let them write the last word. I went back to the market the next weekend. I wasn't sure I would until the very last minute. But I woke up before the alarm, dressed in silence, and carried the folding chairs to the car without being asked. I think they thought I'd forgotten, or forgiven, or both. I didn't mention the sign. Neither did they. My daughter handed me the apron again and said, "Let's make it a smooth one today, yeah?" As if we'd all agreed that smooth meant silence, and silence meant compliance. I nodded, but I was watching. I was looking for patterns I'd missed before. When her voice went tight, when his glances shifted, when I stopped being a person and started being furniture. We unloaded the car together, and I watched how they didn't wait for me to catch up, didn't ask if I was too tired to carry the box with the folding tent. I wasn't, not yet. But they didn't care. The sun was already rising when we set up, and I moved slower than I used to. But I moved. At the corner of the stall, I placed a small basket, mine this time. Inside, lavender sachets, this time neatly tied with twine, a small handwritten sign propped up beside them. Handmade, not for sale. No one commented. Around 10, I excused myself to use the restroom and walked slowly down the aisle of vendor booths. I didn't need to go, not really. I needed to think. I needed to feel the morning outside their orbit. The air smelled like fried dough and strawberries. Children clutched plastic bags of kettle corn. Couples meandered with smoothies in hand. Old men in faded caps debated about tomato plants. It was the same place I had stood for years beside them, helping, lifting, smiling, when I didn't feel like it. But now I looked at it differently. I saw how every booth had a rhythm, a voice, and I didn't have one anymore. I wasn't a vendor, wasn't a customer. I was a background figure, not just at the market, but in my own life. And I could feel, beneath the pleasantries, the truth forming in the space between their words and mine. When I returned to the stall, there was a woman with short gray hair holding one of my sachets. She smiled and asked, "Did you make this?" I said, "I did." She said it reminded her of something her grandmother used to keep in her drawers in the springtime. She pressed the sachet to her nose and bought 3 without asking the price. My daughter didn't even look up. My son-in-law gave a tight smile and said, "Mom's hobby. Keeps her busy." The woman blinked, hesitated, and said, "Well, she's got good hands." Then she left. I didn't say anything. But something in me settled like a stone dropped gently into deep water. The shift came that evening, small but sharp. We'd returned from the market, and I was unpacking the leftover jars, wiping each lid before placing it in the pantry. My daughter stood beside me, scrolling through her phone, not speaking, not helping. Then she said it, casually, as if it didn't carry weight. "So, I was looking at some places nearby. Assisted living, just for future planning, you know. There's a spot opening in a really nice one. Full meal service, activities, transportation. You'd have your own space. It's a big step, but maybe something to think about." I stopped wiping. My hands stayed on the jar, sticky from raspberry residue. I didn't look at her. "I thought I had my own space," I said quietly. "You do, of course," she replied too quickly. "But it's not really set up for long-term comfort. And with the kids needing more room, we've been thinking, just exploring options." That's all I nodded once. My ears were hot. My chest felt like a locked box rattling from the inside. The next day, I came back from my walk to find the hallway closet open. My winter coat was missing. So were the scarves I'd knitted, the heavy black shoes I wore for long walks. I asked. My daughter said, "Oh, we're just doing a bit of early spring cleaning." Some things were looking worn. I thought I'd donate a few. The coat had been Derek's last gift to me. The scarves were mine, handmade. She hadn't asked. She hadn't thought she needed to. And in that moment, I realized she didn't see it as mine anymore. She saw me the way people see leftovers in the fridge, occupying space, expiring soon. Later that week, I overheard them talking in the kitchen. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I was looking for the peppermill. But I stopped just short of the doorway when I heard my name. "She's sweet," my son-in-law was saying, "but it's like having a houseplant that talks. You water it. It sits in the corner. Doesn't mean it belongs in every room." My daughter laughed, not cruelly, just tiredly. "I know. And she means well, but She's just always around, watching, touching things. It's like she doesn't know how to disappear quietly. My breath caught, but I stayed still. The market was fine, he continued, but that basket thing was weird. Like a protest. You saw the sign? Not for sale? That was passive-aggressive. My daughter made a noise. Agreement, maybe. I didn't stay to hear more. I went back to my room and sat on the edge of the bed. I looked at my nightstand. On it, the sachets I'd refused to unpack, the last photo of me and Derek taken at our 30th anniversary party, and the notepad where I used to write down grocery lists and reminders, back when my opinion mattered. I picked up the pen and started a new list. Not groceries, not chores. A different kind of list. 3 items: documents, cash, address. I still had a small checking account in my name, the one I'd opened after Derek died, meant for emergencies. I still had my ID, my Medicare card, my own signature. They hadn't taken those. Not yet. In the back of my closet, my real closet, the one in the garage they'd assigned me after turning the guest room into a home office, I kept a metal tin with receipts, keepsakes, and a folded index card with the name and address of a woman I hadn't spoken to in years, Margaret Lane. Used to run a stall beside me at the market. Left town after her son tried to get power of attorney over her land. She said, "If they ever come for you, remember, your feet still work." Use them, I hadn't forgotten. The next morning, I asked to be dropped off early at the market. "We've got a few things to set up first," my daughter said, clearly irritated. I insisted. I told her I wanted to look around before things got busy. She gave in, barely. They dropped me at the corner and drove off. I waited until their car disappeared down the road, then I turned and walked. 4 blocks to the bus stop, 3 transfers, 1 ticket bought in cash. I had the address written on a torn envelope, the metal tin in my purse, and 2 sachets tied in fresh twine. Not much, but more than nothing. Enough. I didn't leave a note. I didn't say goodbye. What do you say to people who pinned a price tag to your back? The bus smelled like plastic seats and dust. I sat by the window and watched the town slide away behind me. Slowly, gently, like something you release because it's already stopped holding on. The paper was still in my pocket. Folded. Flattened. The same one from last week. I didn't need to read it again. I knew what it said, what it meant, what I meant now, not for sale, not ever again. And this time, I wasn't asking anyone's permission to believe it. The place Margaret lived wasn't what I expected. I remembered her as sharp-edged, practical, not one for frills. And yet her little house on the corner of Old Harbor Lane looked like something plucked from a quiet calendar. Yellow paint fading in places, wind chimes rustling like cautious laughter, a ceramic goose by the front step wearing a knitted scarf. I stood there for a minute before knocking, unsure what I'd even say. The last time we spoke, it was in hushed tones behind our vendor tables, 2 women passing bitter truths between jars of pickled beets and crocheted mittens. She had left not long after that, tired of being told she was stubborn when all she'd ever been was self-owned. I remembered admiring that, envying it even. I knocked once, twice, then heard shuffling, a dog barking behind the door, and finally her voice, older but still firm, asking who it was. I said my name, the full one, like I used to when answering phones at the shop. There was a pause, then the click of the lock, and when she opened the door, she looked at me with eyes that had seen enough life to skip the niceties. She didn't ask why I was there. She simply stepped aside and said, "Come in then," as if she'd been expecting me all along. Inside smelled like old cedar, brewed tea, and something faintly floral, maybe talcum powder or dried lavender. I told her everything. Not all at once, not in some dramatic rush, but piece by piece, as if laying out fabric to check for flaws. She didn't interrupt. She didn't gasp or tusk or say, "I'm sorry." She just listened. That was the thing about Margaret. She didn't believe in reacting. She believed in seeing. After I finished, she nodded once, slowly, and said, "You're not surprised." And I wasn't. Not really. The surprise had drained from me weeks ago. What remained was understanding. The cold, steady kind that sits in your chest like a stone floor. "They want the house back," I said, more to myself than to her. "The story they're building doesn't have room for someone like me anymore." Margaret raised an eyebrow and sipped her tea. "You ever notice how people who preach about gratitude are always the ones expecting it from you?" I smiled, but it didn't reach far. She offered me the guest room, which was really just a converted sunroom with a daybed and a mismatched dresser, and I took it without shame. I'd left behind more than space. I'd left behind a role that no longer served either of us, and now I was here. Not as a runaway, not as a refugee, but as a woman beginning again. That week I walked. A lot. Through streets I didn't recognize and ones I vaguely remembered from some long-ago church fundraiser or quilting fair. I found a corner cafe that served proper tea in ceramic mugs and a library with wide windows and generous silence. I stopped wearing the apron. I let my hands return to their old instincts. I mended a tear in Margaret's curtain, replaced buttons on one of her blouses, and one afternoon, I stitched a fresh sachet. Not because I had to, but because the lavender was drying on the windowsill, and my fingers itched with the memory of usefulness. Margaret didn't say thank you. She left it on her pillow that night and mentioned 2 days later, "Slept better than usual." That was more than enough. At the market down by the wharf, I noticed a flyer. Vendor slots available. Small table fee. Priority to local crafts. I stared at it longer than I should have, then tore off the bottom tab with the number. I didn't call right away. I carried the tab in my coat pocket like a charm or a dare. At night, I would smooth it out on the dresser and stare at the phone, then fold it again and put it back. I wasn't afraid of rejection. I was afraid of being seen again, as if stepping forward would invite scrutiny I hadn't prepared for. Margaret saw the tab one night when I emptied my pockets on the counter. She didn't say anything then, just noted it with a glance. The next morning, she left a paper bag by my plate at breakfast, a set of folded linens, and a bundle of old but clean zippers. "You'll need these if you're gonna sell anything decent," she said, pouring coffee without meeting my eyes. I didn't thank her, not directly. I just took the bundle and held it close. By the end of the week, I had 3 items ready: a zippered pouch with floral lining, 2 hand-stitched bookmarks, and a padded glasses case. It wasn't much. It was a beginning. I registered under the name M.L. Co., my initials, my maiden name. Not a disguise, just a reminder. The stall was small, sandwiched between a woman who sold homemade soaps and a retired teacher with vintage postcards. My table was plain. No branding, no flashy signs, just a placard that read, "Repairs and Keepsakes." The first day, I sold nothing. But 3 people stopped to ask about the bookmarks, and one woman, asked if I could fix a broken strap on her cloth purse. I said yes. When she asked my rate, I paused and said, "Fair." She handed me the purse and said, "I'll be back next week." I stayed the full market day, not because I had to, but because I wanted to see the sun set through the canvas tops of the other booths, because I wanted to be among people who saw fabric and thought of stories. Back at Margaret's, I stitched the strap with careful hands, reinforcing the seams, replacing the hardware with a small brass ring from my own supplies. When the woman returned the next Saturday, she gasped. Not in that exaggerated way people do when they want you to feel flattered, but genuinely, like something in her memory had been restored. "You made it better than it was," she said, handing me a 10 and walking off before I could decline. After she left, I looked at the bill in my hand for a long time. It wasn't the amount. It was the autonomy. No one else had claimed it. No one else had approved it. It was mine. By the third market day, I had customers who returned. Not many, not enough to call it a business, but enough to make me stand taller behind the table. I added a new sign beneath my name. Not for sale. Only for hire. It made people chuckle. It made me feel real again. That week, I bought a ledger notebook and started tracking expenses. I didn't need to. It wasn't about profit. It was about shape, order, identity. At night, I wrote notes in the margins. Who smiled, who lingered, who asked about my old hands and called them capable. Margaret glanced over once and said, "You keep writing like that, people are going to think you matter." I looked at her and replied, "I do." Finally, one evening, I received a message through Margaret's landline. An old friend of my daughter's had seen me at the market. She left a voicemail, cheerful on the surface, but edged with inquiry. "They've been worried," she said. "They didn't know where you'd gone. Thought something might have happened. Maybe you could just let them know you're okay?" I didn't answer. I didn't want her voice in the house. Margaret didn't ask who it was. She simply erased the message and said, "Dinner's getting cold." I sat down without hesitation. Later that night, in the dark, I unfolded the old sign. I still had it. I kept it not for sentiment, but for precision. I needed to remember how clearly they'd labeled me when they thought I wouldn't push back. I traced the edge with my thumb, then folded it once more, and slipped it into a pouch, one I'd made just for it. Not to carry it around like shame, but to own it properly, like a scar that healed the right way. It was the first thing I'd ever sewn for myself. I think the moment it shifted, truly shifted, wasn't dramatic. No slamming doors, no letters on fire, no loud confrontation. It happened quietly, in the back room of the community center, under flickering lights and the smell of instant coffee and worn carpet. I had gone there on a whim, really. Margaret had seen a flyer pinned on the corkboard at the market. Volunteers needed for sewing repairs, Wednesday drop-ins, 2 to 4 p.m. She waved it at me like a challenge, muttering, "You might as well put those hands to use before arthritis takes them for good." I smiled, because she never asked directly, only pointed at doors I could walk through if I wanted to, and I did. Not because I needed the work, not for pay, there was none, but because I missed the rhythm of being needed in a way that didn't feel like exploitation. So I went, half expecting to find a room full of dusty chairs and empty tables, maybe a board coordinator with a clipboard, but instead, I walked into something strange and almost sacred. Half a dozen women of varying ages, hunched over patchwork, jackets, backpacks, and soft toys. Their voices low, their fingers swift, their eyes kind in that way only people who have suffered their own small indignities can be. I was handed a pile of items with a shrug. "Whatever you can do," said a woman named Alice, who wore her graying hair in 2 braids, like she refused to apologize for getting older. I settled in, took out my own thimble and thread, and worked quietly. I fixed a split seam in a child's coat, reinforced a knee patch with navy cotton I'd brought from home, reattached a zipper to a purse that smelled like wintergreen gum and liniment. No one asked my story. No one asked my age. They just let me be useful. Afterward, as we packed up, Alice placed a hand on my wrist, not tight, not lingering, just present, and said, "You work like someone who remembers what it's like to be proud." I nodded. She didn't know how much that meant, but I think she suspected. That evening, I walked home slowly through side streets that smelled like fireplace smoke and wilting roses. My hands were raw from the thread, but steady. I stopped by a shop I'd passed a dozen times and never entered, a second-hand clothing store with a lopsided mannequin in the window, wearing a coat 2 sizes too large and a price tag written in faded ink. Inside, it smelled like old closets and cedar chips. I browsed with no real goal, touching things the way a pianist tests keys, just to feel the memory in the fabric. Then I saw it. A navy wool coat, herringbone pattern, collar just high enough to shield the wind, pockets deep enough to carry more than just hands. I tried it on. It fit like something I'd forgotten belonged to me. I stood there in front of the mirror for a long time, longer than I should have, tracing the seams, straightening the sleeves. I bought it with the money from the pouch repair, plus a little from the tin I kept in Margaret's cupboard. The girl at the counter wrapped it gently, almost ceremonially, and said, "You look like someone who's got places to be." I told her I did, and I meant it. That Sunday, I wore the coat to the market. Not because it was cold, it wasn't, but because I needed to feel the weight of it on my shoulders. A weight I had chosen, not one handed to me. Margaret noticed immediately. "Well, damn," she said, squinting at me over her thermos. Someone decided to stop shrinking. I didn't answer. I just set up my stall, laid out my work, and stood tall. The first customer of the day asked about a coin purse, then stayed to ask about repairs. The second brought a tablecloth she said her grandmother had embroidered. The third just stopped and said, "You look like someone I should know." I said, "Maybe you do." And then I sold her a sachet with clove and lemon balm that I'd stitched the night before, thinking of the lemon trees Derek had once promised to plant in our yard but never did. That smell, the almost memory of something that never quite happened, lingered in the air long after she left. That afternoon, I returned to the community center for another sewing day. Alice wasn't there, but a younger woman named Corinne was. She had nervous hands and the kind of voice that gets quieter when someone interrupts it too often. She brought in a pair of jeans with a shredded hem and asked if I could help. I showed her how to fold the edge, pin it properly, run a steady stitch, not because she needed it done for her, but because she needed to believe she could do it herself. She smiled when it was finished and whispered, "I didn't think I could make anything good anymore." I told her the truth. Most people don't know what they're capable of until someone stops interrupting them. She blinked like it hurt to hear and then nodded, folding the jeans carefully like something precious. That night, I wrote a letter. Not to my daughter, not to my son-in-law, to myself. Just a few lines on the back of an old recipe card I found in Margaret's kitchen drawer. You are not an afterthought. You are not a favor. You are not an appliance left on the counter because it might be useful again someday. You are a woman who stitched her life back together by hand. And that means something I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. I folded it into the pocket of my new coat and pressed it flat with my palm. That was the shift. Not loud, not public, just firm. A reclaiming, quiet as breath. I was no longer waiting for a phone call that wouldn't come or a meal I wasn't invited to. I was no longer waiting to be seen. I had seen myself, and that would have to be enough. No, that would be everything. Because I had remembered something too many women are taught to forget. I do not belong to those who undervalue me. I belong to myself. And my hands, though older now, still know how to make a life. The letter came on a Tuesday, a plain white envelope with no return address. The name on the front, written in looping handwriting, that tugged something loose in my chest before I even opened it. I stood at the kitchen counter in Margaret's house, the smell of onion soup simmering behind me, and held that envelope like it might catch fire in my hands. I knew who it was from before I even unfolded the paper. Kieran, my grandson, the only one who used to sit beside me on the back porch just to be near, who once painted a birdhouse red because he said it looked like a lighthouse, and that I was the only one who ever kept him from drifting. The letter was short. No grand declarations, no accusations, no theatrics. Just, Dad and Lisa are freaking out. They said you disappeared. No one's heard from you. I've been checking every day. I miss you. Please let me know you're okay, and a phone number written carefully beneath it. His number, not theirs. I stood there for a long time, rereading the words. There was no anger in his lines, only concern. Not the kind that masks control, not the kind that comes with guilt or hidden contracts. Real concern. I didn't cry. I never cry when it's expected. But something settled in me like warm water poured over a brittle leaf. He noticed. He remembered. He cared not because he had to, but because something in him refused to forget what it meant to feel safe next to someone. I folded the letter and slid it into the drawer by the stove, next to Margaret's measuring spoons. That night, I didn't sleep, not out of fear, but because my mind kept walking through every birthday party, every whisper of a car ride, every drawing he'd handed me with shaky letters that always ended with, "For Grandma." I wasn't ready to call, but I saved the number. That felt like a beginning. The next week at the market, a man approached my booth, lingering longer than necessary at the corner where my sewing needles were lined up in rows of 5. He wore a jacket too expensive for this side of town and sunglasses even though the sky was gray. He pretended to be interested in a pincushion shaped like a tomato before saying, "You're Mrs. Harlow, yes?" I looked at him carefully, then said, "I might be." "Who's asking?" He gave a rehearsed smile and said, "My name's Derek Sorensen. I represent your daughter and son-in-law. They've asked me to speak with you regarding your well-being and some next steps. They're concerned. You understand." My spine straightened instinctively, not out of fear, but readiness. "My well-being is excellent," I said. "As for next steps, I take mine one at a time, and I've never needed assistance crossing a street." He fumbled then, unsure if I was being literal or not. "They're very worried." "There was a newspaper article recently. You may have seen—" "I did," I said. "I thought the picture was flattering." I'd forgotten I still had that blouse. He blinked, clearly thrown. They're hoping you might consider a conversation, maybe with a mediator present. It doesn't have to be formal. They just want to ensure you're safe. I am safe, I said, because I'm no longer near them. His expression flickered, the smile cracking just slightly around the corners. I understand this has been difficult. You don't understand anything, I replied calmly. Tell them this. I am not a lost dog. I am not a missing heirloom. I am not to be tracked, claimed, or filed under concern. I left. And that's all they need to know. Then I turned, slowly, and began folding the linen napkins on my table. He hesitated before walking away. That evening, Margaret passed me a cup of tea and asked, "Did the lawyer smell like aftershave and entitlement?" I nodded. She said, "They always do." We didn't talk more about it. We didn't need to. The next day, I wrote a letter to him, Derek Sorensen, Esquire, and kept it brutally short. I am of sound mind. I am in a safe, stable living situation of my own choosing. Any further contact under the guise of legal concern will be treated as harassment. I have retained local counsel. You are not to contact me again. I signed it with a steady hand and mailed it from the post office with the same fingers that had written permission slips, signed checks for groceries I never ate, and ironed patches onto jeans no one thanked me for. It felt like sealing a door. I didn't check if he replied, but I did check for something else. Kieran. A week later, he called. I let it ring twice before answering. "Grandma," he said, like the word had weight. "I'm here," I said. And then neither of us spoke for a few seconds, which somehow said more than anything. "You're okay," he finally whispered. "I'm better than okay," I said. "I'm free." "Where are you?" "Somewhere I chose." "I'm glad," he said. "I just wanted to hear your voice." I nodded into the silence and said, "And now you have." He didn't beg me to come back. He didn't ask for explanations. He simply said, "I miss you." And I told him I missed him too. And that was enough. For now. But the world doesn't like women who disappear without permission. It wants us to ask before we slip out the door, wants us to be apologetic in our autonomy. So when Lisa showed up in person, polished coat, cautious smile, I wasn't surprised. She walked into the cafe where I worked 3 mornings a week and pretended to browse the pastry case. I didn't go to her. I let her stand there, squinting at chalkboard prices, pretending not to notice me wiping the counter. When she finally spoke, her voice was tight. "Martha." I turned slowly. "Lisa, can we talk?" "You're talking now." She winced just slightly. "Privately." I nodded toward the booth in the back. "Seats open." She slid in like someone bracing for impact and said, "I didn't know Adam was going to send a lawyer." "And you didn't stop him either," I said. She said nothing. "They're worried," she added. "We thought maybe something happened." "You just vanished." "No," I said. "I walked away." "You just didn't watch." She looked down at her hands, perfectly manicured. Always were. "I didn't think you'd leave." "I didn't either," I said, "until you made it clear I wasn't welcome." She didn't argue. She couldn't. "Kieran misses you," she said finally. "Then he knows how to call," I replied. "I wasn't trying to replace you," she said quietly. "I just didn't want your shadow in every room." I nodded. That, at least, was honest. I'm not your shadow, Lisa. I'm not an ornament. I'm a person. And I finally remembered how to be one. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She just stood and left her coffee untouched. That was the last time I saw her, but not the last I heard from them. A new envelope came, thick with printed statements, pamphlets, and another letter from Adam, filled with concern, cloaked in command. We're willing to talk, it ended, but only if you're ready to be reasonable. I burned it in Margaret's sink. She handed me a match without being asked. Should have used the grill, she muttered. More dramatic. I smiled and watched the pages curl. The next day, I gave Kieran a gift. Nothing grand, just a quiet bank transfer, a few $100s. For books, I wrote, or food, or getting away, if you ever need to. He replied with one word. Understood. That night, I slept the whole night through for the first time in weeks. No creaks, no dreams, just breath. They kept trying. A magazine article, a Facebook post I was shown by a friend at the library. The family had crafted a narrative. Missing grandmother, possibly confused, vulnerable. I clipped it and pinned it to the wall above my sewing table, not as a threat, but as evidence of how easily they rewrote me when I refused to follow the script. Heather, my boss at the cafe, said, "You okay?" when she saw it. "Never better," I said. Arthur, the man who came in every Tuesday for black coffee and oatmeal, brought me a magnet shaped like a birdhouse. "Made me think of you," he said. "Thanks," I replied. I always did like birds that flew in odd directions. They didn't come back, not directly, but I heard from others, secondhand worries, twisted questions. One even asked if I'd been scammed into running away. I wasn't scammed, I said. I woke up. But I knew what was coming. The pressure hadn't ended. It was gathering. It always did before a storm. So I wrote one final letter, not to them, to myself. You let go. You didn't fall. You walked. That matters. Remember it when they come knocking. I slipped it into my recipe box beneath Derek's old pecan pie card and waited. Not in fear, in certainty. Because I wasn't for sale. And I wasn't theirs to find. It was market day again, the kind where the air was thick with pollen and the booths hummed with slow conversation and the soft thump of jars being unwrapped, stacked, and turned just so. I arrived earlier than usual, not out of anxiety, but because I needed the quiet. There's a certain peace in being somewhere before the world wakes up to its own noise. A space where you can breathe without defending it. I wore the coat again, though it was too warm for it. It wasn't about weather anymore. It had become something else, something closer to armor or truth. The pockets were lined with intention. In the left, my ledger notebook with the new page marked in red ink. Debt paid. Ties cut. Freedom confirmed. In the right, a folded square of paper I'd stared at every night for 2 weeks. The original sign, the one they pinned to me when they thought I'd stay quiet forever. I set up my stall slowly, deliberately. My hands no longer shook. I knew what I was doing. Every needle laid out like a declaration. Every pincushion a witness. Every spool of thread spun tight with memory. I brought one new item that day, just one. A handmade canvas banner, stitched in clean block letters with a quote I'd copied from an old book about sovereignty. It read, "A woman's silence is not your inheritance. I placed it front and center, let the breeze lift it slightly as if the air itself was nodding in agreement. I didn't look for them, didn't expect them, and yet I knew they would come. People like that never let go without one final performance. The question wasn't whether they'd arrive, it was how I would greet them when they did. It happened in the late morning, just as the crowd swelled with families pushing strollers and students trying to look like they weren't broke. I felt the shift before I saw them. My daughter's nervous laugh, the way Adam's voice pushed forward like a politician shaking hands. They weren't alone. Behind them trailed a woman with a camera and another with a clipboard, both too neatly dressed to be locals. Press, or something like it. A story being orchestrated. I stood still behind my table as they approached. Lisa didn't meet my eyes. Adam smiled like he was about to win something. "There she is," he said loudly, gesturing to the camera crew. "This is Martha, the heart of our family business. We're so relieved she's safe." The woman with the clipboard nodded and moved closer. "Would you mind if we asked a few questions? Just for our piece on intergenerational resilience and caregiving?" I stared at her like she'd offered me a poisoned drink. "I would mind," I said, clear and calm. "In fact, I object entirely." Adam stepped forward, fake confusion all over his face. "Mom, don't make this difficult. They're here to help share your story, to show how we've supported you. You pinned a for sale sign on my back," I said. The crowd stilled around us, not dramatically, but with the kind of silence that spreads like spilled oil, slow and total. "You thought it was funny. You told people I was a burden. You sold my belongings without asking, and now you want a headline that turns your shame into charity." Lisa finally looked at me then. Her mouth opened, closed. No words came. I reached into my pocket and took out the paper, the sign. I unfolded it slowly, held it up for the crew to see. The handwriting, their handwriting, crooked and rushed. "This is what they thought of me," I said, my voice steady. "They called it a joke. They used my body as a surface for mockery. And now they want to recast it as a misunderstanding wrapped in family values." The woman with the camera shifted uncomfortably. "We weren't aware of—" "No," I cut in. "You weren't. Because you didn't ask. Because you assumed the older woman standing quietly must be grateful for any narrative she's offered. But I'm not, and I won't be used again." Then I did something simple. I turned the sign around and pinned it, not to my back this time, but to the front of their own stall, where the jars of preserves sat in neat rows, like little monuments to the performance of wholesomeness. I didn't shout. I didn't weep. I simply walked to their table and, with the same precision I used to mend a torn hem, affixed the sign to their front display. "For sale," I said. "This is what's for sale." Not me. Never again. A murmur rippled through the market. Not judgment. Recognition. The kind of sound people make when they see something they've known but never said aloud. Adam moved to pull the sign down, but the woman with the clipboard held up her hand. "Leave it," she said softly, her voice suddenly different, real. Lisa's hands trembled. She looked older than I remembered. Not because of time, but because of exposure. She had expected to control the story, and now it was unraveling stitch by stitch. "I don't understand why you're doing this," she whispered. I looked at her gently and said, "Because you taught me how." When you took away my space, when you laughed behind my back, when you forgot I was watching. You showed me how to disappear. Now I'm showing you what it looks like when I return on my own terms. I turned and walked back to my stall. No applause, no music, just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after something permanent. I sat down, picked up a piece of mending I'd started earlier, and threaded the needle with slow care. The day continued. People still bought bread and jam and soap. But something had shifted in the air, something that didn't belong to them anymore. At the end of the day, when I packed my things, I left one item behind on their table. A small sachet of lavender, tied with gold thread. No note, no message. Just a reminder that even healing has a scent. And that it doesn't belong to those who bruised you. I walked home alone, the weight in my coat not heavy this time, but grounded. I didn't look back, not out of pride, but out of completion, because the moment had passed through me and out the other side, and what was left wasn't anger or vengeance, but air, clear and breathable. Mine. It's quiet now. Not the silence of exile or punishment, but the kind that comes after a long, deliberate act of remembering who you are. The kind of quiet you earn. Most mornings, I still wake before the sun, not out of habit anymore, but because there's something about the early hours, the stillness before the town exhales, that makes everything feel manageable. I drink my coffee on the porch now, not in a rush, not with ears strained for the sound of someone else waking up and needing me, but simply because I like the way the steam curls into the morning light. Margaret's taken to joining me sometimes, sitting beside me with her own chipped mug and her silence, which is not emptiness, but understanding. We don't talk about what happened, not because it's forbidden, but because there's nothing left to dissect. It's behind me now, not erased but closed, sewn shut with strong thread, the kind that doesn't unravel even when tugged. The market has changed, too. Not drastically. No parades, no sudden reinvention. But people know me differently now. They come not just to buy, but to linger, to talk about things that don't need fixing. I've stopped apologizing for how much space I take up behind the table. I sit straight. I look people in the eye. I let my voice carry. It's not about defiance, it's about re-entry. Some women bring me small things they're too embarrassed to show anyone else. A blouse that no longer fits but means something, a broken locket, a child's toy with stuffing falling out. They always say the same thing before handing it over. It's probably not worth much. And I always answer the same way. If it wasn't, you wouldn't have carried it this far. They understand what I mean. They always do. Kieran writes sometimes, short texts, not sentimental, but warm. Once he sent me a photo of a notebook with the first page filled in, his handwriting tight but sure. She taught me that leaving isn't failure. It's proof that you knew when to stop waiting. I didn't reply with words. I sent him a picture of the birdhouse he once painted, now sitting on my windowsill. The red is fading, but it still stands. Some things do. Lisa and Adam haven't tried again. Not directly. I suspect they've adjusted their story, as people do. Maybe in their version, I'm unstable or irrational or simply old. Let them. That story isn't mine to carry. I'm not in their version anymore. There are days I feel tired, not from age, but from clarity. It's heavy, seeing yourself truthfully after so many years of being told you're only lovable in fragments. But it's also honest. I've made a life here, not a big one, not a loud one, but a rightful one. I volunteer twice a week now, teaching basic mending to anyone who wants to learn. Last week, a woman in her 70s asked me how I learned to sew so cleanly, and I told her, by fixing what others thought was ruined. She laughed, but then she looked at me differently. She understood the weight beneath the words. Sometimes, late at night, I walk to the edge of the street where the light from the lamppost barely touches the road, and I stand there with my hands in my pockets and breathe until the air doesn't feel borrowed. I think about the women I used to be, the girl who wanted quiet more than praise, the young mother who gave everything without terms, the wife who swallowed every slight with a smile, the mother-in-law who folded herself to fit into corners. I don't hate them. I just don't owe them anything anymore. They brought me here. But I walked the rest of the way on my own. And if you're reading this, if you are a woman standing in the doorway of your own life, wondering if the cost of reclaiming it is too high, if silence is safer than truth, I want you to know something. They will not thank you for walking away. They will not understand why you stopped bending. They will call it cruelty or confusion or failure. Let them. Your dignity doesn't need their understanding. You do not owe anyone your quiet. You do not need permission to become whole. I keep the sign now, not out of bitterness, but because it tells the truth. Not their truth. Theirs was always conditional. But mine. I was for sale once. I let myself believe that being useful was the same as being loved. I thought loyalty meant disappearing politely. I was wrong. But I'm not anymore. Now I walk into rooms knowing exactly what I'm worth. And no one, no matter how close they once stood, gets to price me again.